Yeah, just listen to your little brother here. Wade, just leave it. Candy asses. All of you. I know what I've got for children. Jesus freaks and candy asses.
In that family, love is this, you know.
Yeah.
You know, I love you. The loved one gets the beatings.
Yeah. You must have felt some personal connection with these characters. It's a small town like the town where you grew up, yes?
Yeah, I mean, I know these people. I grew up with them. I was not the product of an alcoholic, abusive father. I had a very strong father, and I have an older brother, but it's not necessarily my story. It's a little more autobiographical to Russell, the novelist. And the film ends rather bleakly, you know, and the films I have written on my own tend to end with a kind of grace note.
Yes.
There is no grace note here. There was no grace note in the novel, and I did not add one.
Paul, let's move on, talk about Taxi Driver. You've described how you wrote this film, how you were, you know, living alone and everything like that.
It was written as self-therapy. It wasn't written, you know, to make money or get famous. And I wrote it in a rather dire period of my life. I was not a screenwriter at that time. I was a critic. And a number of things had gone wrong in my life, and I ended up in a period where I was drifting, living in a car, and had this pain in my stomach, and went to the emergency room, and turned out I had a bleeding ulcer. And I realized when I was there that I hadn't really spoken to anyone in weeks. You know, I had just been drifting around. And this metaphor of the taxi driver occurred to me, that I was like this person in an iron coffin, surrounded by people, but absolutely alone, you know. You know, in many ways, I wrote that script so I would not become that character.
You said it leapt out of you like an animal or something?
Yeah, I mean, it was, and it had to be written. So it was written as therapy, and I therefore got involved in films for the best reason possible, which you see less and less of today. You know, I got involved because I needed to get involved.
You say, I've got about 20 questions in the result of that. The first thing I want to ask is, that's an extraordinary idea, that you think that Taxi Driver in some way has a kind of ameliorating influence on people. Is that what you mean? That people who are potentially psychotic can watch this and...
They see, hopefully it will do for them in some fashion what it did for me, was to put that kind of self-absorption, that kind of festering, masochistic, narcissistic anger in a context.
I'd like to look at the end of the picture, which is incredibly close to how you wrote it. And in fact, you wrote the script many years before it was filmed. Here's a little bit of the ending. You say of Travis, he forms his bloody hand into a pistol and raises it to his forehead. His voice, croaking in pain, makes the sound of a pistol discharging. Travis's head slumps on the sofa. Live sound ceases. Overhead, slow motion tracking shot surveys the damage. Now that's, you're almost writing as a director, you're writing the shots?
It's the only camera direction in the whole script.
Yes.
I don't believe that writers should write camera instructions.
Yeah.
I don't write them for myself, I don't write them for others. The only exception to that rule is when you can only express a certain mood by camera instruction. And the mood in that case was complete detachment from the events, a kind of God's eye floating view. And in order to get the idea of a God's eye floating view, I had to do an explanation of an overhead tracking dolly. Otherwise, I would never put camera instructions in a script.
Let's have a look at this famous ending that is anticipated so much in your screenplay.
This is a shot from Hitchcock. It's from Marnie. I mean, I know Scorsese. I know, it's a shot from Marnie.
This is precisely as you wrote it.
Yeah.
And did you know that Marty Scorsese would shoot it as you wrote it?
I didn't know Marty when I wrote it.
I know you didn't. But once he got on board, did you know that he would write it, he would shoot it?
No, it was that's his bailiwick, you know. This shot, we were on location, but they actually had to, it was a building that had been condemned. They had to actually tear out the floor above this in order to lay rail, you know, through the ceiling.
When the camera goes high, when it's the God's eye view, to use your own words, we feel he's dead, don't we? And then he's not dead.
Yeah, well, that was intended to be kind of fooling the audience, which was, there's another way to look at this.
We've got the very end of the film now, Paul, because this is different from how you wrote it.
How much was it?
This is after the killing. So here he drives off.
Yeah.
In your script, he doesn't drive off. She says, maybe I'll see you again sometime, huh?
Uh-huh. Well, you have to understand that, of course, when they shot the film, she said that line.
Yes.
So you're not talking about a writing or directing decision. You're talking about an editorial decision. And editorially, Marty was moving on somewhere else, which was this notion, which I supported, of the film as a loop, and that it begins where it ends. And that the last scene of the film is the opening scene, and that the film is actually a loop, and it can be shown indefinitely, that nothing has changed. His pathology is still in place. Bob called me up once while we were shooting, and he said, you know, do you think this character, Travis, because he was wearing my boots and my shirt at the time.
Which is a very scary thing, I have to say.
And he said, do you think this character, do you think he would say this? I said, Bob, look, you know, I'm in Los Angeles. I'm working on something else. You're in New York. You're Travis Bickle. If you think he would say it, odds are he probably would.
But it's clear that Robert De Niro understood that you were Travis Bickle, and sometimes, yes?
Yeah, but that was a serendipity, you know. I mean, three young men at similar stages in their lives, coming across the same story, knowing the same story, knowing how to tell it, knowing why to tell it. You should never discount the factor of luck in motion pictures and art in general. Sometimes you just get lucky.
We're now in the mid-70s, and you went from this...
Only I wish.
And you went from this period in your career where you were extremely unhappy, somewhat suicidal by the sounds of it, and then you sold the script of the Yakuza for a massive amount, 370...
Yeah, it was the highest price at that time.
And you became a star screenwriter?
Every 6 months has star screenwriter.
And you and Spielberg got together to work on the script of an idea for a movie about flying saucers that became Close Encounters. How was your idea of Close Encounters different from his idea?
Well, I'm going to abbreviate this because this is not a subject I like to dwell on.
Okay.
Because I feel I have my own credits, Stephen has his, and I see no reason to try to impose upon his credits. So Close Encounters is his film.
Sure.
I deny any authorship. My original draft of it was much more kind of biblical in the sense that it was a kind of St. Paul sort of character. He was named Paul, who had a close encounter like Paul on the road to Damascus, and spent his life, you know, trying to make contact again. I fell out with Stephen on this because he wanted this person, the first person to leave the planet for another life form. He wanted that person to be an ordinary Joe. And you know, I remember I said, you know, I refuse to write the first person to leave our planet to join another world only to go up there and start a McDonald's. And Steven said, that's exactly who I want. And I realized then that the difference was so deep-rooted that I would have to leave. And it was rather traumatic because I had very strong feelings about it. But you know, Steven had a vision that precluded mine. And ultimately, his vision is in the film and not mine, and it is his film.
Is there anything of you in the film?
I won't even go in there. I won't even head that direction.
Okay, I'll say what I've heard, which is that you wrote the idea of the archetypal place.
I don't even want to go there.
Okay, well, I won't push you any longer. I think that it does seem to me there's something sort of obsessive in the film that may be yours. Anyway, then you started directing. You made the film Blue Collar, which you wrote.
I really didn't know how to direct then. I hadn't figured out how to direct until American Gigolo. So it's not really so much directed as kind of managed. And it was a very difficult situation, and a lot of very tough personal and racial politics were going on, and I barely survived it. So I don't feel I was in complete control of the situation. I basically somehow got the herd, from Wichita to Dallas, but I really wasn't in control.
So the actors were Richard Pryor, Yaphet Kotto,
and Harvey
Keitel.
Yeah.
Now, the scene we've got here is apparently the last one you shot.
Yeah.
The three of them are sitting on the sofa in some way planning their heist. What do you remember of shooting of that?
By this time, the actors were no longer talking to each other. And they would no longer even rehearse with each other. So you had to rehearse with them individually. Richard Pryor had gone back on cocaine, for which he blamed me. Yaphet was drinking. And as soon as all three were seated, I said, action. They did the scene once. It was a little long. I was afraid if I said cut, it would be the end of the film. So I said, we're still rolling. We're going again. Speed it up. Action. We had enough film in the camera for a second take. They picked it up by a minute. I said cut. Richard Pryor got up, walked out, got in his car, went home, and the movie was over.
Every time I get coked up like this, I think I'm never gonna go back to the plant. Don't know why the fuck I do.
Because the credit man need your paycheck.
Credit's the only thing you can get free from the company. Got a house, fridge, dishwasher, washer, dryer, TV, stereo, motorcycle, car. Buy this shit, buy that shit. All you got's a bunch of shit.
Huh.
You don't even own it. Can't give it back because it's already broke down.
Sometimes I get so depressed. I start thinking about the shit I promised Carolyn. Shit I ain't never gonna be able to do.
I read that you cried on the set of making this film. Why did you cry?
There were a lot of personal conflicts on that film, and violent conflicts and racial conflicts. And one day, after a particularly grueling situation where an actor had walked off the film and was headed for the airport, I realized that I would probably not finish this film, and that it was my first film, and if I didn't finish it, I would never direct again, and that my aspirations to be a film director were over. And I was just sort of overwhelmed by this emotion, and I started crying. And Richie Pryor, who had been the source of many of these conflicts, took one look at me and said, well, you're going to be a man or you're going to be a pussy? And I said, Richard, let's go back to work.
At the same time that you were writing this, is it true that Robert De Niro came to you and said, look, we've got this problem with this Raging Bull script?
No. It was shooting the end of Hardcore.
Oh, yeah.
And Bobby showed up on the set, and he doesn't show up because he wants to be sociable.
Oh, yeah.
He shows up
wants
because
something.
he wants something. In this particular case, he wanted me to rewrite Raging Bull, which was more his idea than Marty's.
Yeah.
And he had sort of dragooned Marty into it and then dragooned me into it. And so I agreed to rewrite it.
And the climax of your script, I heard, was the cell scene when LaMotta's in prison. It's 1957, Florida. What happens? What happened?
Well, I mean, there was... it's the same as in the film, you know, Jake is in his cell. And I wrote a monologue for De Niro, a masturbation monologue, where he is trying to masturbate by conjuring up the women he has known in his life. And every time he conjures one up, he also conjures up what a jerk he has been to these women, and it makes him, shall we say, flaccid. And so he has to start over with the next woman. And the same thing happens. And finally, he gets so frustrated with his inability to have sexual release, he starts smashing his hands against the wall and blaming his hands and this and that and this and that. Anyway, Marty called me up and said, Bobby's not comfortable, you know, doing that. You know, at that point, you defer to the actor. And then they came up with that I'm not an animal thing, you know, which was an alternative.
Why?
I haven't seen this since it came out.
Really?
Why are you doing? Why? You're so stupid. You're so stupid. So fucking stupid. You're so stupid. You're gonna be an animal. I'm not an animal. I'm not an animal. Oh, you want to treat me like this? I'm not that bad. I'm not that bad.
Well, I mean, I can tell you the difference,
Yeah.
for better or worse. You know, the scene I wrote sort of begins when this one ends, you know, that he's smashing his hands because he can't jerk off.
Okay, let's go back now to your upbringing, to the period, the famous period now, before you saw a movie. What was it like? Where were you brought up and what was it like?
I was brought up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which at that time, and still is, but less so now, a Dutch community. And, you know, they were rather strict folk. And sometime in 1928, the church issued a synodical decree forbidding what they called worldly amusements, which was that theater attendance and card playing and smoking and dancing and drinking and so on. And so I grew up in a world without those things.
There must have been a kind of repressive quality to that. For example, what was that community's attitude to like visual culture, the kind of visual way of making meaning that you ended up doing?
Well, it was not approved of.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, their idea of visual culture sort of stopped with stained glass windows. You know, if you had something to say, you said it in words. Listening to these uneducated, rough-hewn farmers discuss the great issues of life, good and evil, moral consequences, etc. I mean, that's a great way to grow up in terms of having grounding and principles in life rather than growing up in front of a TV set.
Okay, could we have a look now at a bit of hardcore? Because you mentioned it before, it's in some way autobiographical. As we watch, could you describe how it's autobiographical?
Yeah, well, this is Celery Farm, obviously. Van Dorn, a good Dutch name. And this takes place at a Christmas reunion. Oh, they're singing my college song right there. And, you know, that's my mother right there. You know, this was how I spent my Christmas. And, you know, these are my uncles, that's me. There's another scene coming up shortly, this scene right here, which actually happened. Uncle Joe got up and he said, television, this is made by kids who couldn't get along here, and they go to Hollywood and they spread their crap back at us. He said, well, I didn't like them when they were here, and I don't like them out there.
Oh, Uncle Joe, what are you doing?
You know who makes it? All the kids who couldn't get along here. They go out to California and make television. I didn't like them when they were here, and I don't like them out there.
And that's exactly what that actor just
And
said.
that's exactly what you became, is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
What did you tell your family when you were making this picture? Did they know this was a sort of devastating portrait of them?
I heard that my father had gone to Chicago to see the film. Now, he did not see motion pictures. So I called him up and I said, Dad, you know, I heard that you went to Chicago to see Hardcore. There was a pause, and he said, yeah, I did that. And I said, well, what do you think? And he said, well, he said, I'm glad your mother wasn't alive to see it.
Huh. And you're smiling now, but that must be hurtful.
No, I mean, that was his one and only comment on my career.
But didn't he later, I read, he was part of the campaign against Last Temptation of Christ?
Yes, yes, yes.
So your father was campaigning against your work?
Yeah. Well, the way he described it, you know, he didn't see my films in there, and he wasn't interested in them. Although, ironically, he kept copies of all the videotapes I had ever done, but they were always in their original wrappers.
Huh.
So he liked the idea that his son had become successful. He just wasn't going to watch any of it. And around the time of Last Temptation, he started calling me up and asking this film, and when's it going to be released, and how many theaters. Now, these are not things he talks about or cares about. So by the third time he called, I said, Dad, are you involved in the movement to block this film? And he said, yes, but only locally. And in fact,
extraordinary.
In fact, he did block it locally. It was never shown in my hometown.
Paul, what surprises me is when you talk about your father's opposition to your work, you talk in quite a cheery way.
Well, I mean, I survived, you know.
It must have been wounding, though, in some way.
No, I came out of that culture, you know, like a bullet comes out of a gun, and I had a lot, you know. I remember once talking to one of my professors about how energizing I had felt it to be, to know very clearly who you were and where you were and who the other guys were and what you were going to do with your life. And my former professor said to me, he said, yes, you know, he said, that was wonderful for you, but believe me, it cripples and injures far more than it helps.
Yes. And why did it not cripple and injure you?
I don't know. I mean, some kind of, you know, survival gene.
You must be pretty robust. One of the key films in this time for you was Bresson's Pickpocket.
Yeah, still is. If I have to pick one scene to represent all of cinema, I'd pick that scene.
Really?
Yeah.
Why? Why? You said that it was the greatest expression of the human spirit or something. Why?
It's the magical intervention of the spirit into human affairs.
Well, explain that. What's exactly happening there to that man?
Well, you're talking about a cold, cut-off person who has been denying his emotional and spiritual life. And in one bold moment, everything breaks through and he makes physical contact with his true life, you know, with the life of the heart and the soul.
I think it's fair to say that this film had a considerable influence on your own career, and I've been sneaky enough to now put on the tape two scenes which I think were directly influenced by that. So if
Well,
we could
they're not influenced, they're copies.
copies, exactly. Let's have a look.
Why did you do it?
I had no choice. I love you.
Did we ever fuck?
What?
You know, make love.
Well, there was that Christmas party. Everybody got so stoned and...
No.
You came over and crashed at my place once and we slept together.
We were naked.
Mm-hmm. We tried.
I was thinking about it, and I realized we never really did. It's one of the things I think about. One of the things I look forward to. I've been looking forward.
Me too. Strange how things work.
In the first one, I actually went like Breton and used the Mozart.
Yeah.
And the first one is actually the same line, you know, the translation in English sometimes.
Yes.
But it is, you know, what a strange road I've taken to come to you. And the second one, I was sort of toying around how to end Light Sleeper, and I said, you know, it really should end the same way Pickpocket was, and why not? Just do it. Just end it the same way. I don't care.
But it's very moving. He says, I've been looking forward.
Yeah.
And it's almost like most of your characters can't look forward. They're busy trying to cope with the present.
Well, you know, it's that notion that only when we accept our imprisonment can we be free. Only when we accept our determined fate, the prison house of the body, as Calvin would say, when we accept these limitations, then we can burst free. And so in Pickpocket and in Gigolo and in Light Sleeper, it's the imprisoned man who finally gets free.
When did your mother die?
During hardcore. So that would be 78. Thanksgiving Day, 78.
And you made a film in 1987 called Light of Day, in which you portray the time of her death.
Yeah.
What Jenna Rollins says is what your mother said.
I mean, this was my mother's deathbed scene with me. You know, and she called me in and made me promise something, which I did promise, and I put it into the scene with Joan and Jenna.
We've got it here. Are you okay about watching it?
Sure, sure.
It's
only movies.
Have I done anything so terrible that I can't be forgiven? Have I? No. Oh. Oh.
She's thinking now.
There's one last favor that I want to ask you. Yes? Just one last thing. Yes. What is it? I want you to join me in heaven. I want you to say that you'll be there. Will you? Yes, will you? Yes.
Yeah, my mom did that to me.
And you lied to her?
I lied.
You lied to her because you didn't believe in heaven, and yet you told her you would join her there? Is that it?
Well, I mean, there's a certain moral obligation to lie.
Sure.
In a situation like that.
Paul, I'm not criticizing you at all for lying. I feel I feel embarrassed talking about that scene. It's so intense, but that's what you did.
Oh yeah, I told her. I told her I would.
The next film that you wrote and directed was called American Gigolo. It seemed to be a very different subject matter in some way. Los Angeles, fashion, the surface of things. Was it?
Gigolo was the first film I thought I actually figured out how to direct. And a lot of that was under the influence of Conformist by Bertolucci, and I began to learn how to think visually.
The first scene I've got here is the Richard Gere scene where he's getting dressed and you've got the music. What were you trying to do in that scene?
Well, you know, when we shot it, I described it as it's an artist and his palette. It's like a painter doing a self-portrait, looking at, you know, his collection of paints and deciding how he will imagine himself.
Oh, yeah.
While doing cocaine, of course.
Yeah. Okay, let's have a look.
There you were, beautiful. Promise of love was written on your face.
You know, it's a classic kind of scene. Scorsese has one in Mean Streets. You know, the getting dressed scene, getting all dolled up to go out on the town.
Yeah.
You know, in this case, it's pushed just a little further with the male narcissism and the upper body nudity and the Smokey Robinson and the cocaine, the Armani clothes. But it is a kind of classic male scene.
And this seems to me one of the first films of yours that has a real kind of homoerotic content.
Well, it was a very happy period of my life. I moved predominantly in gay circles, even though I was with a woman at the time. A lot of the inhibitions that I had been inculcated with because of my upbringing, I didn't quite know how to deal with in terms of women. And, you know, by hanging out with the boys, I really learned about physical culture, you know, how to touch, how to embrace. And I realized that that's all really women wanted too.
The next scene we've got is again from American Gigolo, and it's the sex scene, Gere and Hutton.
Oh, this is from Godard.
Say a bit more about that. How is it from Godard?
And one of them, it's stolen from Godard, you know. I went to Godard because of the cold physical voyeurism of Godard.
Now, I'm just going to slow-mo there. That is one of the strangest scenes. What's happening? Her hair is hanging over. Is she looking down at the camera, or is she sitting upright?
And she's looking at the camera, and
he comes up in behind it.
He comes up like this,
Yeah.
and then raises himself up.
Yeah. And then the next film you directed yourself was one that you didn't write, which was Cat People. Now, why did you take on a film that you didn't write, and why did you take on a genre film?
Well, you know, it was offered to me by Universal, and it was a mighty temptation to do what I thought at that time. I would do a genre film, I would do a non-personal film, I would just change and do something different.
This is the sex scene at the end.
I love this sequence. It is very perverse. So. In the original script, it had a rather conventional ending. There was a big dark house that blew up and the monster was killed. And it occurred to me, in thinking about it, that wouldn't it be more interesting, instead of killing the monster, what if he makes love to the monster in order that she can return to her natural animal form. But thank God at that time we didn't have research screenings.
Oh, yeah.
Because they would, definitely this ending would have been thrown out and I would have had to reshot something else.
What was happening in your own life at this stage? Were you a happy person?
What had happened is during the making of this film, I got involved with Nastasia, and that ended up breaking up the relationship I was involved in, and then when the relationship with Nastasia fell out and the other relationship couldn't get put back together, the cocaine, which until then I had been using, started using me, and I realized it was time to move. And it was at that point I left Los Angeles because I couldn't see anything positive coming out of that descending spiral I had found myself in. So I moved to New York to start over. I met my future wife in New York, and she got pregnant, and then we moved to Japan, and my daughter was born. I did a film in Japan. And Japan was basically my drug rehab.
And you came up with one of your best films, Mishima.
Yeah.
The instant the blade tore open his flesh, the bright disk of the sun soared up behind his eyelids and exploded, lighting the sky for an instant.
And then you made what I think is your best film, Light Sleeper. Tell me about the origin of that process.
Well, you know, at any given time, you're fooling around with a life problem or dilemma. You're trying to find a metaphor for it, you know. So in the case of Taxi Driver, it's loneliness. The case of American Gigolo, it's the inability to express love. You know, in many ways, what you do as an artist, you know, you have a problem which you hopefully think is somehow universal and that will relate to other people's problems of the same sort. Then you find a metaphor. Now, if the problem in the metaphor, this is a damaged finger, it got, my mother shut the refrigerator on it. If the problem and the metaphor are the same, there will be no spark, there will be no life. If they're far enough apart, a spark will jump. That spark is what has meaning. At the time of Light Sleeper, I was somehow trying to deal with this classic kind of midlife crisis thing, you know, this feeling that your life's mission is over. And I was trying to find a metaphor for this dilemma. I couldn't find one, and for years I had looked, and I finally gave up looking. And then one night I had a dream. And in this dream, this drug dealer I had known during my drug days came to me, and his face was immediately in front of me. And he had come and wanted me to write about him. And that the drug delivery boy was my midlife metaphor.
Why is the main character played by Willem Dafoe in this film? Why is he called John Latour?
Again, Latour, tour reflecting like Travis, someone who tours around.
Yeah.
You know?
But he's a healthier person than Travis, isn't he? He's recovered in some way, hasn't he?
Yeah, yeah, but he still doesn't.
He smiles a lot more than Travis.
But he still doesn't have a life.
Until the end.
Yeah. He's still trying to find a life, you know.
I've got here I just love it so much, this scene where he has coffee with his former girlfriend, and you're saying he hasn't a life, but he thought he had a life with this girl, didn't he?
Yeah, but it was a drug life.
It was a drug life. But this is your most emotional piece of writing, would you say? It's like your Douglas Sirkian piece of
Yeah,
writing.
it's pretty good. It's pretty good.
You were an encyclopedia of suicidal fantasies. I heard every one. I mean, nobody could clear a room like you, John. And the friends you may have noticed turned out to be mine, not yours. I envy you. Convenient memory is a gift from God.
You exaggerate.
In rehab, it's called euphoric recall. You only remember the highs, never the lows.
We were happy.
I was drowning.
Why do you jump?
Across the line?
She's on the left, and then he's on the... It's
Yeah.
like what we're doing now, because we're jumping a line now.
It's called jumping the line.
Yeah.
And in fact, the table, in fact, gets bigger. It was a long scene, and I had to break it up visually. And you can only go so far, you know, dolly master, two-shot, over, single. You got to break it up. And I was watching rehearsals, and I was thinking about an old country western song I liked a lot by Merle Haggard. And the lyric of it goes, somewhere between your life and mine, there's a wall that I can't see through. And I was looking at this pillar, and I said, yes, you know, somewhere between his life and hers, there's a wall that he can't see through. So let's just jump over the line and show the wall that he can't see through. This is too big. They will never get through this.
Yeah.
It wasn't me.
You watched.
You jumped.
You did nothing. It wasn't your business, not your responsibility. You still think like that.
No.
Actions have consequences. So do
I didn't.
inactions.
I meant well.
You always meant well.
We were in love.
Yeah.
We were happy.
Your films are about troubled people in many ways, and so when I was watching recently, I thought to myself, I wonder how often Paul Schrader feels simple joy. You know, that writer Joseph Campbell that you've spoken about as well has this phrase, the rapture of self-loss, the absolute time of joy. How often do you feel absolute rapture of self-loss?
But it actually does happen from time to time, and that's exactly how often it should happen. You know, from time to time. You know, joy and pleasure and rapture are the kind of spice of life, you know. They're not the meat and potatoes of life. They occur now and then, and you can hang your existence on them, but it's not day-to-day existence.
Paul, it's been a really enjoyable afternoon. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.